welcome Ravi to take us to the next.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I thank you for Jared and the team for inviting me to moderate the session. It's my pleasure to have two colleagues from the FSD family, Gabriel and Rafe. My job is pretty straightforward, to introduce the speakers and moderate the questions. We have two very interesting presentations. And first we'll start with Gabriel, who's going to talk about developing credit markets. The previous presentation talked about data and the importance of data, and many of you are practitioners. You're focusing on data at an individual level, the individual borrower or the individual provider, the bank or the SACO. From an overall development point of view, from policymakers, from my role in World Bank or Central Bank, we're looking at the country as a whole, and we're looking at the region as a whole. And 10 years ago, I remember, we didn't have credit information. When the World Bank and IFC did their doing business indicators, one of the assessment points for access to finance was presence of credit reference system. Yes or no? If you had one, whether it's public or private, you got a tick, you got a few points. If you didn't have one, nothing. At that point, there wasn't much measurement of how the systems were being used. Over time, that's changing. So, I'm very pleased to have Gabriel, who's got a wealth of experience, which you can read about in your delegate's handbook. He was the first CEO of the National Credit Regulator in South Africa. And he's currently Program Director of FSD's Africa's Credit Market Development Project. So he's going to talk to us about the state of the markets, what issues he sees, and what opportunities he sees. I'll follow up with Rafe's introduction after Gabriel is done, and then at the end we'll have questions for both our presenters. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to go at a huge speed here. So if you're going to fall asleep, you're going to miss it. What I'm doing in FSD Africa is we're running credit market development programs in different parts of Africa. This is an extract of the actual data that we get from a couple of different countries. The point really is that we're trying to do a stock take of what types of loans you get, what profiles of loans you get in different countries. If there's only 3,600 mortgages in Tanzania, which is the number, 3,600, in a country with 40-odd million people, with Dar es Salaam having 2.5 million people, why is there only 3,600 mortgages? What's the constraints to the market? So the point really is to pull out the data, to compare the profiles in different countries, and then to start figuring out now what is going wrong. We are only 10% towards what is actually missing, but 2 or 3 things do stand out. Credit reference bureaus is exceedingly important, however, mostly they don't work. Because why? Because banks don't submit the data. The data they do submit is exceedingly weak. Let me make you the other conclusion right as we stand. Why do banks generally not lend or non-banks not lend? Because the defaults are so high. In some of the countries we see default statistics on agricultural finance of between 19 and 30%. Now I'm not sure, if I'm a lender, I'm not going to lend if every third loan has to be written off. So there's a couple of hard truths that as policy makers and as regulators we have to start getting to grips with, otherwise we can't really move ahead. Let me get going. My whole focus within the FSD Africa, and maybe my focus for the last 30 years, has been on retail credit markets. Because we can talk about financial sector development and financial inclusion until we're blue in the face. But if the credit can't flow through to the actual individuals and businesses in the countries, in the communities, what the hell will we achieve? All we will achieve is more credit to corporates and more credit to wealthy individuals. And our retail credit markets very often is still dysfunctional to a large extent. These are just the stats. Most of you would have seen some variant of this already. Just to highlight one point, in private credit to GDP is 21% across sub-Saharan Africa. The Latin American and Caribbean number is 46%. So we're pretty much halfway Latin American, Caribbean is in simply that number. In some countries like Chad or DRC, it's as low as 5 or 6% of the GDP in credit. The OECD indicator, or the country like South Africa, is 140 odd percent. So the difference is massive. And remember, we're saying as a percentage of GDP. We're not talking about here of the countries not developed. The GDP is there. What we're really saying is credit makes very little contribution to the development of that country. Credit makes, so the GDP is there, production is taking place, but credit is not flowing. This is from a very good research report, really well read from McKinsey, came out last year. It is really about the banking, this is the banking sector. Most of the rest of my presentation is all credit, bank and non-bank. But on the banking sector, the graph that you see there, Africa is that dot there. Sorry for the age. Emerging Asia is there. You will see that African credit markets, in comparison to the rest of the world, is microscopically small, really, really small. However, the growth rate is the second highest of any region in the world. The profitability is the second highest of any region in the world. If there's going to be action in the next 10 to 20 years, it is going to be in Africa. This is where the exciting stuff is happening, where the growth is happening, but the catch-up to be done is huge. So part of my passion in the world is to say, let's recognize the challenges and deal with them, not in a half-hearted way. Let's get moving. The default rates, this is just simply, I'm not going to go through, take you the detailed slide, they are there. The default rates in African credit markets is very high. The NPLs and loan defaults are very, very high. It is particularly high in agricultural finance. It's also very high in business finance. The cost of credit delivery is very high as well. It is some of the high, I think it's the second highest in the world, the cost of credit delivery. The cost of credit delivery, a little bit related obviously with low population densities and with infrastructure that is not that well developed. And hopefully that's one area where technology can make a difference. Although I also suspect we must be careful for this new god being the internet-based and digital credit that's going to supposedly solve all our problems. I think 80% of our problems would not be solved by digital credit or internet-based credit. Hopefully I'll get back to that just now. This is just some of our internal calculations, and maybe I should say my internal calculations on cost of credit, and this is cost of delivery, this is not interest charge, for different products in Kenya compared to the interest rate caps. Obviously, it is the small transactions that will get cut off. It is the mortgages and the corporate loans that can be provided profitably under these interest rate caps. Now let's remind ourselves that Uganda is talking about interest rate caps. In Tanzania, there's been some talk about interest rate caps as well. So the more politicized these credit markets of ours become, the more there's talk about interest rate caps, the more our whole objectives of financial inclusion or credit to small businesses are going to be defeated. However, as policymakers, and I think industry as well, we are extremely bad in pulling out the statistics so that we can go to the politicians and say, this is who will suffer. Because in Kenya, with all people are going to shoot me just now, but with the 2 or 3 years since the caps here were introduced, the data of showing the actual impact has actually been very weak. Now, let me get back to my two examples. We do, as we stand here, we do detailed projects in, I mean, a little bit in Kenya, but mostly Zambia, Tanzania, now going into Ghana, now going to Sierra Leone. What I want to do out of the next couple of slides is get to some detailed numbers of what we see in here. And then the real challenge, obviously, is what does this mean? When going forward, where are the priorities for legal reform? But you heard my conclusions in the introduction already. Firstly, I'm not going to take you through this detail, just to make sure you're awake. What we do in all these assessments is we took at all the credit providers, bank, non-bank, SACCO, community-based institutions. We go to all of them, obviously sample basis, then extrapolate and try to actually calculate how many loans of each different type of loan are there. What are the sizes? What are the distribution of the sizes of these loans? Therefore, how many very small, medium, large size? What are the terms of those loans? And then obviously lots of engagement with the credit industry, then to try to find out what are the factors that are limiting the capacity of the industry to grow beyond where they are now. I hope those are clearer, not terribly much. I can therefore tell you that in Zambia, as we stand here, probably have the best credit market information anywhere in the world. If I have to be more conservative, I'll say in Africa, but it's probably anywhere in the world. I want to see one country that has got as much information on different types of lending than what Zambia has. We can tell you there's about 1,100 large business loans of around 350,000 US dollar each. Small business, 39,000. 1,000 compared to 69,000, sorry. Average value 351, average value about 2,000. We can similarly have extracted the numbers on large agriculture. There's only 441 large agricultural loans the whole of 2016. 441. It's a little bit low for a country where the dominant source of employment is agriculture. Small agricultural loans more, but only 3,000. The whole credit sector only provides 3,000 actual loans for smallholder in agriculture. Guess where the lending is, by the way? People with employment and mostly unsecured. Something like 90% of all lending happening in that country goes with people with jobs. So when we talk about, as bankers or credit providers, how we're changing the society, I wonder. We are giving credit to those people that's got jobs, mostly for consumption purposes. The more interesting is when we start comparing, this is Tanzania, this is Zambia. Now, just as you guys hopefully know, Tanzania is about 3 times bigger than Zambia. So here we're trying to get the numbers now. So what do the numbers say? There is, you're not going to read, sorry. There's about 116,000 SME loans in Tanzania compared to about 24,000. 24 times 3 is 70. Around 70, and there's 140. Zambia is leading Tanzania massively when it comes to business finance. The same for agricultural finance. Same for, by the way, every single category of finance we can think about. Only, 100 and something thousand business loans from the banking sector in Tanzania. But there's 1.4 million business loans, micro-enterprise loans from the community banking sector. There's about 500,000 each from MFIs and SACCOs. So as I'm looking at this as a what am I? Policymaker, development practitioner. If we want to make a huge impact in Tanzania, I'm going to disagree with myself here. One huge impact must be through the non-banking sector. We have to give more and more and more attention to the non-banking sector. That is where we're going to get to low-income people, not through the banking sector. I'm very sorry. However, like Mao Zedong said, we have to walk on 2 legs. Obviously, the same challenge is that the banks must expand. And the question again, as a policymaker, I ask is, why is the banking sector as limited as it is? But by the way, this is before we did the stats. As a South African, I compare that to the SME lending in South Africa. They're not doing terribly badly at all. As Kenyans, I want to challenge you. You don't have this data, by the way. I want to tell you, I want the Indian Kenyan to tell me what's the aggregate credit across SACCOs in the banking sector. That stat I've been looking for 3 years now. So we can carry it on agricultural finance. We can, let me skip this, but let me just quickly talk about housing loans. Only 3,000 mortgages in the whole of Tanzania, a country with 45 million people. Dar es Salaam has got 2.5 million people. How is that possible? From the banking sector point of view, as an ex-regulator, if your banking sector is dominated by short-term small loans, your risk is sky high. A banking portfolio of small short-term loans can go bad within 2 or 3 years. Any OECD country, anywhere in the world you can look at, the banking sector stability comes from long-term stable asset pools. In most African countries, we don't have that. One of our huge priorities will have to be increase mortgages, take the constraints away. Our savior is not going to be in $11 digital loans. It will be good for pushing consumption. It's not going to get business finance going. But when we look at SACCOs, and these would be loans that, look at the average loan size, it's only $360 each. So it's small loans, but you can see where people in Dar es Salaam or all over Tanzania actually build their houses from. From a small loan, build a room. Take another small loan, build another room. That is how housing development in Africa is happening. Digital, I'm going to say only one word because my colleague will talk a lot about it. Let's just look at the very small sizes. $11 outstanding balance average in Tanzania, $17 in Zambia. Arrears rates are 49%, between 49 and 30%. Let us just make sure that all of this doesn't get on the credit bureaus, because we could get 50% of our population blacklisted very quickly. So we must be very cautious of the way that this integrates into the information system. Concluding, if we talk about the broad picture of the challenge of financial sector development, credit market development, there is a whole host of stuff we can talk about. Do people have ID books? Are there multiple identities around? Do people have property, title deeds over their property? Capital markets development, the access and cost of long-term funding. In my view, digging into this for weeks and months on end, there's a couple of things that really stand out that from the policymaker angles are really, really important. Getting better statistics. If we do not know what is going on in the credit market, as a Kenyan question, how does the SACCO lending compare to the bank lending? What does those loans going to? How does it grow over time? The point that Sam made in his excellent presentation earlier, the interface between borrowers that borrow from SACCOs and from banks. I want to guarantee you that's going to be some of your next bank failures. And I'm saying that as a South African. That's what we've seen in South Africa. Our alternative lenders grew up quite dramatically. Our banks started failing because they underestimated the risk that came from multiple borrowing. But once we have better statistics, we can both assess the risk, we can provide the market with better statistics so the players, the credit providers can make better strategic decisions, and we can identify where the real problems are lying. But the trend analysis is going to be long-term, where it's going to be interesting. What is changing? What is moving? Credit information sharing. Of all these mechanisms, it is the one mechanism that in the shortest period of time can make the biggest impact, because you can share, even if somebody's got 5 ID books, put all 5 credit bureau numbers on the credit bureau, and you will know there's 5. And add the driver's license, add the passport. Through the credit bureau, we can get this information. However, in most countries, and by the way, in this area, I've worked in probably about 30 or 40 countries. In most countries, the credit bureau system is terribly bad. It would have, at best, 30% underreporting, at best. Mostly it's around about 50%. And of that 50 to 70% information that is reported, a good percentage is wrong. Now, imagine yourself on one of these nice Nairobi highways, driving if you can't see 50% of the cars. So a weak credit bureau report is, well, it's not worse than not having a credit bureau report, but it's something that is completely undermining the value of the credit bureau system, and the weakness is the industry's fault. They all try to underreport all the time. And the second weakness is the regulator's fault. They don't hit industry hard enough. They don't penalize them hard enough. If the best regulator in my book is the governor from Monrovia, who made a rule that says you don't report and you don't need to do an inquiry, you automatically get a 20% risk weighting on all these loans that did not get inquiries done. Automatically. Hit them where it hurts. As hard as you can, as often as you can. Have I made the point? Central banks, many central banks, we still find how to have explicit and implicit rules that actually really block lending. Many central banks would have, let me forget the explicit ones, the one that says the risk weightings are higher, that you have to get hard collateral before you lend, because they are there as well. On business lending, many central banks, in fact, the majority, would have some little rule somewhere that says bankers are encouraged to get financial statements on all business loans. Encouraged. Or it may be should try to, or some subtle terminology. How does the bank's legal department interpret this? If you don't get financial statements, you don't lend. And sometimes it becomes audited financial statements. What percentage of these businesses that we want to lend to, whether it is fairly big sole proprietors or whether it's financial statements audited? From the lenders, from a bank's perspective, they'll tell you, look, we can evaluate the risk without the financial statements, because we know the financial statements is not worth the paper they're written on, because they're written for the taxman. So, but why as central banks do we make rules that explicitly, decisively limit the growth of our credit sector? Mortgages, the problem also here, the central banks are going to throw things at me now. We don't even understand very well why the credit is not flowing. Default rates, one can actually should really spend 20 minutes talking about default rates as well. If there's one thing that policymakers can help the industry, is make sure that debts are collected. Make sure that defaulters are enforced against. Make sure that judges are not bribed. We get this feedback all the time, by the way, that the credit providers tell us, look, or the borrower, the easiest way for the borrower not to pay is simply going to bribe the judge in the local court to lose the file. Now, if that is how we're going to operate, then we should not be surprised that is informal lending or digital credit or payroll-based credit, that's the only stuff that grow. But that is not a good future for credit in Africa. Debt enforcement. So, where we are really coming from, you can hear, this is my passion, what we're trying to do is to get better statistics, because if we do not understand what is actually going on in credit markets, in African credit markets, we really can't move forward, because we are consistently misspecifying the problems, spending energy and time on all kinds of things that when you look back at the big picture, you say, guys, this is not where for me, there's really only two factors. Get credit information going and make sure that debt enforcement happens. If we can get those two things right, improved on, we will have credit market improvement in Africa across the continent. At that point, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel. Before we move on to the next presentation, just a few takeaways that I have, and we'll come back to the questions after the next session. Just to summarize some of the interesting points that Gabriel has made. One, data is limited. With all the efforts that are going on across the region, there's still challenges with data. So I think there's a lot of work for all of us to do, central banks, providers, to improve the situation on data. The second one key point was when you actually even have the data and banking data, it's scary how low the numbers are on credit. Private sector credit as percentage of GDP is still low. And the numbers showing that it's largely the lending is happening to, as he put it, employ people for consumption. And so what are we doing about the non-employed people, the businesses, and for non-consumption purposes or productive purposes? He also mentioned an interesting provider, which I hope somewhere in the session there's more, in the conference there's more attention, is SACCOs. SACCOs are often excluded from some of the numbers we looked at. And he also talked about housing. So a lot of work to be done. He's presented some challenges and some opportunities. I'd like to call upon Rafe. Rafe is a consumer protection specialist. Used to work for CGAP and currently does advisory work for the Gates Foundation and FSD Kenya. Rafe has just recently finished a project looking at innovation and data sharing, and he's going to present some new ideas from that, and then we'll try and pull the two together.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. So, as mentioned, what I'm going to talk about, this is a conference on credit information sharing, but I want to expand our horizon a bit broader to what we're calling data sharing models. And so this includes credit, and credit's often one of the first drivers of this, but it goes beyond and looks at the other information that is being generated in the economy. And so what I'll share is kind of some higher level takeaways from a report that I did looking at these models across the globe, models like what we hear about, like open banking in the EU, or GDP, or open banking in the UK, or EU and GDPR in the EU, and also dive a bit deeper into how this might play out in our region and in our markets. And if you want to access the full report, there's actually a blog summarizing the takeaways with a link to the full report on the FSD Kenya website, if you're interested. So just to start, from my perspective, when I was looking at this topic of data sharing, I found it useful to create a definition that was really of two parts in terms of what we're talking about. And the first is that I consider data sharing models to be any service, platform, or product that is collecting or creating digital records for individuals. And this can include things like traditional credit information or bank account statements, but it might also include web-based data, phone records, even sensor data, which is more and more being used. And then the second element of this is not just collecting and creating to the data subject, the person of whom's data you're collecting, to make this available to multiple third parties. And this is where we're really talking about transforming the way financial services and other aspects of our economy function and compete. And my big argument for why I think data sharing makes sense is four. One, I think that if we have more consumer control of their financial and related information, they'll be able to better access products because they'll be better known, and you can better manage things like risk assessments or creditworthiness assessment. And related, if there's better information out there, you can then innovate and offer new and more customized products. And some of this can take advantage of the automated decisioning models or the more advanced data-driven segmentation models that are being developed for financial services. And then third, this I think will really improve competition. In digital financial services, we have competition issues, especially in East Africa. We have significant market concentration, we have monopolies, and that has led to consumers being forced to live in these data silos, where the originator of their information dictates whom they may acquire financial services from. So if consumers are at the center of managing their information, we would hope increased competition happens and it's not just the providers picking the winners. And through that, I would hope that over time, you would see some consumer welfare increase in terms of if I can bring my information to more competitors, I can get more competing offers, and we start to compete on quality of service and on pricing, and not as much on capturing control of information. So I'm really optimistic on the potential of this in East Africa in particular, because when I was doing this research, I saw 4 exciting data sources that I love to see brought together through a consumer-centric data sharing model. 2 of them are pretty well known, right? So the data that's been generated by the mobile money revolution, right? That has really dramatically increased the number of consumers with digital financial records and digital access to services. The second is the credit bureaus and the credit information system. But then the 2 emerging ones are alternative data, which I think is a bit hard to classify because it's constantly changing. But this can include, when a fintech scrapes the data on your mobile phone, or when sensors track your geolocation. That data becomes more and more useful. It builds a more robust data profile for us. And then the 4th, and this is maybe the one I'm the most excited about, that I didn't realize how much was going on until I started this research, is what I'm calling the real economy data digitizers. So I ran into a lot of interesting new firms that are not financial service providers. What they are is they're working in agriculture, they're working in fast-moving consumer goods, they're working in pharmaceuticals, and they're working with small businesses, formal and informal, and putting their records of economic activity into digital form. And Gabriel mentioned we have a tendency to overserve salaried consumer lending in these markets and underserve small businesses. But these firms are digitizing millions and millions of small businesses. And I think if we can develop ways in which that information can be shared in a competitive, consumer-centric manner, we would see financial services and some of that gap in terms of serving small enterprises and serving agricultural credit start to improve. But first, we really need both private sector and public policy push to break down these data silos. This is just a stylized representation of a common model we know here, where I'm an M&O who has a mobile money platform, and I've created some useful information on my customers. And that information can be used to provide loan offers to these consumers. Maybe it's going to be their first ever formal financial service or first ever formal loan. But I don't let the consumer share that in the market. I partner with 1 or 2 banks on a revenue share agreement, and I list them on my menu, and that's take it or leave it for the consumer. And so these are the data silos we live in. And what I would love to see is a shift from data silos to consumer-led data sharing. So what this model is articulating is, as you can see on the point 1, is that the financial consumer is at the center and is the controller of their information. So information from financial service providers, both bank and non-bank, credit bureau information, even government records, identity and other, information from mobile money operators. And then the consumer is the one who says when, why, and how this is shared, and they have the right to revoke that sharing of information. Now, that probably seems like a lot to ask someone to manage on a feature phone, which many of our population still use. So the third element of these models that I've seen globally is you need some sort of new intermediary. In the European Union, they're called account information service providers. They have other names in Mexico and other markets. But basically, they're a third party that doesn't provide financial services, but can help you as a consumer centralize and manage your financial and other digital information. And then once you have those in place with proper supervision and rules, they can start to act for the consumer to say, hey, This consumer has all of this information from their mobile money provider, from their bank, from the wholesale seller of agricultural inputs. Who wants to give them a loan? Tell me your terms, and the consumer can receive live, real-time competing loan offers. That's where I want to see this go, to consumers controlling information and making providers compete more instead of these data silos. So from my research, I developed a top 10, because you have to have a top 10 if you publish a report, I've learned, of considerations for these data sharing models. And I won't walk through them in detail. Again, this is in the report. But there are three main buckets of considerations, I think, if we're looking at how could you pull off data sharing models in our markets. It's probably not an efficient use of resources. I think it would be so expensive to make a push in a market where there wasn't sufficient digitization already to digitize just so we could then share information. So I think you want to see, has the private sector developed a digital environment already? And the second is government information. And this includes, of course, ID and KYC information, so you can remotely assure someone is who they say they are. But also more and more it includes things like tax records, property records, movable asset registries. So to what extent do you have that in place before you embark on data sharing models? The next bucket is the policy considerations. And one of the main takeaways I've found in looking at these markets is that you really want to have, in terms of financial sector policy, you want two things. You want a strong competition mandate somewhere, whether that's with a competition authority or in the unique cases where it exists, it's with a financial sector authority that has a dual competition mandate, as well as their traditional stability mandate. And the second is you want to have as little regulatory gaps as possible. This is probably the biggest problem we have in markets like Kenya. So there's a huge unregulated sector. We don't have a financial conduct authority like they do in the United Kingdom, where they pulled off open banking. It'd be great if we did, and there's a bill out there proposing as such. And so what you have is you don't have the ability to make data sharing cover the whole financial sector. So competition and broad market coverage is something I think we need to strive for. Two other policy considerations that are particularly important is data privacy and protection law. We don't want to start giving consumers the ability to access and share their data without some protections in place. Because as we know, if we look at our current privacy approaches in the internet, it's be asked to read a 10-page terms and conditions when you sign up for a new website or a new service. You never read it, you just tick the box. The lawyers on the other side of Google or Facebook or whoever have satisfied the consent requirement, and then they use your data in ways you have no idea. So we don't want to put too much of a burden on consumers to self-protect. So I think it's important also, before we explore these data sharing models, to put privacy laws in place. And we're lucky in, for example, Kenya and Uganda, there are draft data privacy bills that are going through the legislative process. And the other main takeaway I looked at when I thought about where is this succeeding, is that even if the government is not going to build a data sharing model, they need to set rules that mandate all providers of a certain type, such as financial service providers, have to let consumers access and share their financial information. You just don't see this working in markets where it's voluntary, because then the good guys who are willing to share get punished because the guys who won't share take that information and take their customers. So there has to be a mandate to share. If we look at India, the India stack, one of the challenges they've had in having data sharing work for financial services is they have no mandate. Whereas you look at Mexico and the UK, and it's mandated in law, you must let consumers access their financial history and share it with other financial service providers. Then finally, in terms of designing the model, I think we need to, in particular in this region, keep in mind that what worked in the UK or the EU will not necessarily work here, where we can't expect that most consumers have a laptop or have a smartphone. And so we need to be thinking about how can these models let a consumer exert control in what is sometimes a relatively clunky tech experience, right? I don't think you could list all my financial records on USSD and it would be a very pleasurable experience to try and manage consent via that channel. So we need to think about how we adapt these models for our markets and for the technological infrastructure that currently exists. But the good news is, all that being said, I think there are a lot of models we can follow, a lot of new models globally. So I mentioned the open banking in the United Kingdom and the payment service directive in the European Union. But there's also, in Mexico, there's a new fintech law. And so it's a law to regulate fintechs. So it addressed the market coverage issue I mentioned. But it also included in provisions that require financial service providers to let consumers access information and to make available common APIs that other financial service providers can access to receive that information. Now it's different, there's different design considerations in terms of the level of intensity that the government takes in sort of dictating how this is built. So in India, the government created a whole new ministry that is running this thing called the India Digital Locker, which keeps your government information, your financial information, other information sources. In the UK, they didn't create an institution, but they created a public-private special purpose vehicle, which is building a single set of APIs. And they said, you will all agree on these APIs for data sharing, and that's the ones we use. And it's overseen by an entity. In Mexico, they didn't even go that far. They just said, you must let consumers share information, and you must make APIs available. So we have choices in terms of how prescriptive we want to be, but the basic principle is to mandate that consumers have a right to access information and mandate that providers must have a certain level of connectivity with each other so that information can get sent around. Now we're already seeing some interesting private sector innovations around this in East Africa, and this is another reason why I'm hopeful on data sharing models in our region. So I want to just highlight two cases. The first is Maisha Meds, and as I mentioned before, this term, when I'm talking about real economy data digitizers, Maisha Meds is a great example. So this is a doctor who recognized there were serious pain points with keeping inventory, sourcing and avoiding counterfeit drugs and pharmaceuticals for chemist shops in Kenya. And so she developed an app that is basically a bookkeeping app. And she's partnered with large pharmaceutical companies to offer automatic inventory repurchasing, recommendations on which prescriptions are moving faster or slower. And you can imagine that will depend by the season, right? The rainy season, you might have more malaria prescriptions, for example. And also to offer discounted pricing. But one of the first things that the chemists using her app did was they said, hey, how can I take this information and share it with my SACCO or share it with Kenya Revenue Authority? So she wasn't even thinking financial services. That was one of the first use cases that the chemists said. And so they developed a very simple thing on the app where it's just a pop-up where you can email a CSV version of your history on the Maisha Meds app to yourself or to a KRA or a SACCO. And they've now entered a direct partnership with KMET SACCO. And so this was an example where it wasn't even a financial service provider, but the data they were creating immediately had a financial utility for its customers, so they built that function. Another interesting one is Chomoka in Tanzania. So this is an app that is digitizing savings groups in Tanzania. So Village and Savings Loan Associations, what we might call CHAMAs sometimes. And it has a range of functions, including record keeping, you start a meeting, can take attendance, all this is digital. But they're also doing interesting things with the financial side. So they keep each member has an identity and can at any point get a snapshot of the money they've saved, the shares they have, the interest they've accumulated, the money they owe, the loans and the fines, etc. And then they're building a banking marketplace. So you can now take this, and they've created partnerships with 4 banks in Tanzania so far, and you can open a group or a personal account based on this information. And so you see that this is an interesting case where they're not saying, I as Chomoka want to be your only financial service provider, saying, I want to be your gateway to competition. And that's a big difference. These new actors do not necessarily have the conflict of interest that we see with mobile money operators, for example, of being the channel bearer and the financial service provider. And I think it's increasing competition. So thinking about credit bureaus and data aggregators, one of my thoughts for the region is that we already have this rich infrastructure of credit information sharing, which is increasingly using non-credit data as well. So I think that, what we really just need to do is to explore how might we change CRB licenses or licenses for aggregators in the fintech space to allow them, if we create mandatory data pouring, to allow them to start to offer new data analytics services. Because I do think CRBs and others could jump into this role of neutral consumer data manager, and it would really increase competition in the market. So no longer just the banks pulling a CRB record if they want, but rather consumers being able to proactively request all their information, and then a CRB helping them to receive competing offers in real time. And I think we need to get going on this soon, because in the absence of rules, the market makes its own rules, and we don't always like what happens. So this is, I'm really sorry about the image quality, but this is a credit scoring service that is being sold to some fintechs in Kenya from the largest mobile money operator. And what they've done is they're offering a credit scoring system that's based on 4 variables. So KYC, customer profile, and pace of financial information. And the last one, credit profile, that includes bank-based digital loans. So they're taking bank loan records, which should be reported to the CRB and are not always reported to the CRB, unfortunately, and they're doing their own scoring and selling their own scoring outside of the CRB system at 100 shillings a pop. That does not sound to me like the outcome we want. But if we don't create rules and standards, this is what will keep happening. And we're going to have the Wild West where the providers continue to own the data and monetize it, and consumers have very little control, and these data silos persist, that certain channel bearers can pick winners. So a bit of good news to end on. I mentioned data privacy and protection is a key element, I think, for data sharing models. There's a new data protection bill released by the Ministry of ICT about 2 weeks ago in Kenya, which includes a data portability provision, Section 34. And so this does a lot of things that could get us closer to making data sharing models happen in our markets. So first, the data subject, which is the consumer, has the right to receive the personal data concerning them in a commonly used and machine-readable format, right? So it's not just giving you a handwritten or a printout, right? So we're making it not just be access to information, but digitally. Second, they have the right to transmit that data to another data controller or data processor. So that could be a CRB with a new remit to process this data without any hindrance. And 3, where technically possible, they have the right to have this data transmitted from the original data collector to another processor. So that's the portability. So I can say, not only do you have to give me access to my record, where it's technically possible, you have to port that. And the reason why we say technically possible is because maybe we want that in financial services, but it's kind of a bit much if we started asking that of every corner duka, to give a history of all my purchases of vegetables and things, right? So we have to say where technically possible, because this is a law that will affect the entire economy. But I think it absolutely should apply to financial services. So this is where data privacy laws can start to enable data sharing models in financial services and other parts of the economy. So just to conclude, I think this is absolutely one of the most important policy priorities in East Africa and across Africa. And you already see significant policy pushes like that data privacy bill in Kenya, some work in Uganda that's happening. There's just open banking, Nigeria was just launched. So we're making progress. And I absolutely think that the hypothesis I have about increased access, innovation, competition, and consumer welfare will play out if this is done right. But I also would caution that while we don't have our data privacy laws in place, we might want to grow this incrementally. So we may not want to say from the get-go, it's all my raw financial history that can be shared. Because if there's not proper data protections in place, it's a real risk. Maybe we just start with account summary information. Maybe start with a limited set of providers who have the proper data security put in place. And I do think that, as I mentioned before, this will not happen by private sector goodwill alone because of the competitive imbalances in our markets. I think there has to be a policy mandate on data porting, whether it's going to be through like a financial conduct authority and competition authority like in the UK, or through a data privacy bill like they're proposing in Kenya. Someone has to say you must make this available so that it's not just the good ones who willingly share data, but every provider and every consumer gets equal treatment. And then finally, I think in East Africa, we probably can do this with less of a technology build than was needed in other markets, because there are private sector innovators that are already doing things like this that could probably easily adapt what they're already offering. So I know there's a lot, but as I mentioned, there's a full report and I'm happy to discuss in further detail, but I just wanted to put this on the table because I think if we can do anything for competition innovation in these markets, it's this, it's data sharing rules.
Thank you very much, Rafe. So we have another 15-20 minutes. I hate to be the person between you and your lunch, but it's a chance to ask some questions of our two speakers. Please introduce yourself and say who your question is intended for. We'll take 3 questions at a time.
I have about 2 questions. The first one is on credit market segmentation. I'm happy that that in the first session. Do we feel that we are adequately segmented in this market in terms of credit market? Because I speak to the generalization, which is corporate and personal banking. In the last 5 or 6 years, we see another category coming through, which is digital financial services. Different product models have come up. So I feel that we need to do some more segmentation to just capture the customer profiles and the product profiles and the business models that are emerging. The second question is towards KYC. In terms of digitization, it's one of the biggest challenges that we have across East Africa. I think we are fortunate in Kenya to have a database, government database. However, even with that, then how can we optimize? Are we thinking of digital KYC? How can in the future, because especially the markets that are the mass markets, I think that's one area that maybe we can consider, and how can CIPs make or optimize the government databases that in terms of being a one-stop shop, or the hub that has been talked about.
Hi, my name is Alex Van Kuchen of Ramatala. This question is primarily for Rafe. But should the vision that you kind of painted of data sharing in this perfect form ever come to fruition, where, as you said, firms are ultimately competing not on how they can mine and create proprietary sources of data, but how they price and provide service using shared data? In that dynamic, how do you properly incentivize players to create data if they know that they're ultimately going to share with others?
Let me take these first 3 questions, and we'll get to the next round. Gabriel, do you want to take the first 2? Rafe and head on.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot disagree with you about the segmentation comments. My comment presentation really covered a little bit from a policy bias that says we've got insufficient information, not well, both at the segmented level and cross-market. I mean, Kenya, your sub-food sector is the second biggest node of the sector, the biggest African class node, with Senegal being the only one that's competitive. It's, you know, so it's such a huge important sector, but we, as Kenyans, we've got not enough information across these different markets. So, yeah. KYC, just one comment. I mean, one place that I really think we need to start with this is if every single identity document that the client presents to the bank, if they are all reported to the credit bureau, within a very short space of time, if somebody's got 3 ID books, then you would know which is fraudulent. You will know that this guy actually sits with 1 real and 2 fraudulent items. So though it's through all the other solutions are long term. We talk about informing the person identity. Currently, it's like a 10-year project. We want to wait for 10 years before we move on. So we let us at least report. But the banks are too short-sighted. The bank would report that one item. They, in their legal department, they know that there's 2 or 3 others, but they will report one. So we have to expand the reporting on the different personal identity documents so that at least we've got a comprehensive record in the Bureau.
So the question you asked about the incentives, this is something that was one of the hardest things to think through in this research. And one of the ideas that I had is perhaps you classify different types of information and you implement information forwarding gradually, right? So you can start with, I think it's hard to argue that identity information, official identity information and actual financial history should not be more available to the consumer. And I do think the alternative data is really hard to implement portability with because it's always changing, right? So like one of the interesting innovators I saw in the region is a firm, Optometrics, that's using sensor technology, video sensor technology, to try and measure turnover in small businesses. And how would you, one, explain, 2, make easily understandable in an account summary, and 3, make portable that kind of information if the consumer is leading the data porting. So you may have to make a gradual approach. And I think at a minimum, if we just do KYC and formal financial information, the good thing is financial information is easy to find and has regulatory coverage. That might be enough for now. So that may be a way, because I do recognize, one, there's the incentive problem, but also one thing I struggle with is some of the things more about regulation is the definitional problem for a lot of the information that's being used.
Next question.
Thanks. Morning, everybody. Mike Balan speaking from Pakistan Credit Bureau. We run credit bureaus across 6 African countries, and we've got an insight into the problem that we're talking about. I wanted to comment on both of your presentations. Gabriel, you make a very good point about gather as much information as possible, and whether it's from a participatory stance from the sector or the credit bureau trying to bring information in, or a policy and a regulatory view of the regulator saying thou shalt supply data. It's all good and it's all right. But Rafe, you make another point from the data privacy side, and there's this very obvious issue of consent. And if I can challenge both of you to talk a little bit about how do you achieve the congruence of these 2 issues? Because they constantly are fighting against each other. We want more data, but we don't have consent for more data.
I'm going to be the heretic here. I think the consent thing is completely overdone. Asking somebody for consent, and when they know that if I don't give consent, I'm not going to get a loan, why do I ask them for consent? Banks very generally abuse the consent issue. If I don't want to share, I just make sure I don't get consent. I mean, by the way, this is not just Africa, this is everywhere in the world. So if this was my call, I would have said, scrap this whole requirement of consent. It is very much a European Union notion, by the way. South Africa, consent was hardly an issue. Yes, you signed, but I mean, you signed 20 pages. Consent is fine print from page 20. So we are allowing something that is actually very notional. I mean, how many kids are all smartphones all the time? What consent do they? I mean, the only people that are gaining by this insistence of consent are the crooks who do not want to give consent. So if it was, it's scrap consent because greater information sharing will be of greater benefit to with a greater number of people than the dubious privilege, the dubious protection that consensus gives.
Yeah, and I think that's where privacy law is moving, is away from broad-based one-time consent to principles that put more of a burden on the provider, because you recognize the information asymmetry and power dynamics between consumer and provider. And so some examples are things like data minimization, which says any information you're collecting has to be for a specific purpose, and you must be collecting only the minimal data necessary for that purpose. Then also things like rights to revocation, so that there's the consumer has a right to revoke your access to their data. There's also things like rights to be forgotten where you can delete the data, and then rules regarding sharing of data with third parties. So, for example, in main jurisdictions now, you have to name the third party that you wish to share this particular set of data with, and the consumer can remove that right to share at any time. So instead of the typical, I did a review with a lawyer a few years ago of standard form contracts and mobile M&O and mobile money services. And generally it's a consent that I may use your data at any time for a reasonable business purpose with any third party. We're getting away from that. We're saying you have to specify the third party, and there's an individual level right of revocation. So I think, yeah, I agree that the general consent, no one's going to agree. So putting more reliability on the providers for how the good practices on data privacy. And second, putting in place new entities, like the Kenya law will put in place a data protection office to supervise all of this.
Any more questions?
Mine is just a comment on the last question. In my view, I think one of the biggest gaps we have in this market is consumer education. Because if we show consumers the values why we are collecting the data, I believe they will be more receptive in giving consent for sharing that data. But we find that in the last few years, I don't think we are where we are in terms of consumer awareness now. Where that falls between the stakeholders is a debate, but I feel that we should do more so that the customers, the same way we give value proposition for products, we should give them value proposition for their data and show it back to them.
I'll give you a couple more minutes to think of other questions. I have a couple of questions for Gabriel. This might sound a bit strange in a room full of believers in credit information and credit bureaus, but in credit market development around Africa, from what you've seen, has credit information made a difference? Do you see an increase in private sector lending? Do you see an increase in credit? And is our focus here is on information sharing? Is that the main constraint, or are there other constraints as well which we still need to deal with at the same time?
Good question. I'm completely positive. I mean, if you take Kenya, I think it's going to be a market in the last number of years. So it is, of all the things that make an impact, the credit, I don't know any mechanisms that can make a big impact in the short term like credit information. Even in the negative sense of credit, South Africa. Credit bureaus in South Africa for many, many years has worked primarily with one mechanism. That says, if I as consumer don't pay, they can blacklist me and I'm going to never get credit anymore. So it worked through a penalty on the consumers that forced them to pay. And let's be clear, it's not that around it. That impact makes consumers paying their debts. It makes default coming down, it makes credit more extensively available. We need, as I said, the most effective thing is to try to get lower debts at default. The problems in many of this, by the way, I think credit information sharing in Africa is growing more than in any other continent. So either Kenya is a problem with this one. Kenyan credit information sharing market, I think, is probably the highest, the quickest, fastest growing credit information sharing market in the world right now. So lots and competitive. In a lot of the rest of the world, it's one credit bureau, one monopoly. So lots of really positive things. The problems are when not all information, when it's too much of information is not shared, or a sector like suckers don't share, and in Kenya suckers are huge. Business information, very often, even here, I don't know what the position is that personal information is shared, but business information is not shared. Now, where are we then going to get the business information assessment, the business risk assessment information from? So it's the international stats is very, very positive, but quite negative, unfortunately. That the South American numbers shows decline in bank loss rates, default rates, of in the order of 20 to 30%. Just moving from negative information to positive. So the impact on the market is huge.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, well, can we have a round of applause for our two presenters, and will the presentations be available? Are the presentations going to be available? Yeah, so the presentations will be available, and if you have questions for them, grab them. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here. Enjoy the rest of the sessions.